Rikers Island, New York, the shocking reality of jail food in America's largest city. They had 48 hours before the outbreak spread. The health inspector didn't believe the temperature logs. Stay with this story. What happened next exposed a system that had been failing for years. Dr. Sarah Chen stood in the Rikers Island commissary kitchen on August 14, 2019, holding a thermometer that showed something impossible. The walk-in refrigerator displayed 38 degrees Fahrenheit on its external gauge. Her handheld thermometer, placed inside, read 58 degrees Fahrenheit. 20 degrees above safe food storage temperature. In a facility serving 7,000 inmates daily, Chen was a Department of Health inspector conducting a routine quarterly review. She'd worked food safety for 12 years. Hospitals, schools, nursing homes. But Rikers Island was different. At 9:47 a.m., she documented the temperature discrepancy in her inspection report. The kitchen supervisor, a Department of Correction employee named Marcus Webb, checked the gauge himself. System shows 38. Must be your thermometer. Chen placed a second calibrated thermometer inside. Same reading, 58 degrees Fahrenheit. How long has the display been showing 38? Webb checked the digital logs. Since the repair 2 weeks ago, Contractor said it was fixed. What repair? Cooling unit was cycling on and off. They replaced the compressor. Been running fine since. At 10:30 a.m., Chen examined the repair documentation. Date, July 29, 2019. Contractor, Apex Commercial Refrigeration. Work order, replace defective compressor, recalibrate temperature controls. Signed off by Marcus Webb, kitchen supervisor. But the actual internal temperature had never been verified after the repair. For 16 days, the refrigerator had been displaying false readings while food sat 20 degrees too warm. At 11:15 a.m., Chen inspected the food inventory. Dairy products dated August 1st, meat deliveries from August 5th, produce from August 8th. All stored at unsafe temperatures for days or weeks. At 12 p.m., she issued an immediate closure order for the walk-in unit and flagged all perishable inventory for disposal. Webb's face went pale. We serve lunch in 90 minutes. That's all our cold storage. Then you'll have to serve shelf-stable items only. This food is potentially contaminated. At 12:45 p.m., Chen filed her emergency report with the Department of Health. At 1:30 p.m., she received a call from the Rikers Island deputy warden. We have a problem. We can't dispose of that food. It's a health hazard. It has to be destroyed. We don't have replacement inventory. If we throw out everything in that cooler, we can't feed anyone dinner tonight. Then you need to arrange emergency food delivery. On what budget? We're already over on food costs this quarter. At 2:15 p.m., Chen stood her ground. The food had to go. At 3 p.m., the deputy warden made a decision. We'll dispose of the clearly spoiled items. But anything that looks and smells fine, we'll use tonight and reorder tomorrow. Chen was horrified. That's not how food safety works. You can't tell if food is contaminated by looking at it. We have 7,000 people to feed. I'm making a judgment call. At 4:30 p.m., dinner service began. Cold sandwiches. Made with deli meat and cheese from the compromised refrigerator. Chen watched, powerless. She'd filed her report. Documented everything. But she couldn't physically stop the jail from serving the food. At 6 p.m., she left Rikers Island. At 8:30 p.m., the first inmate reported to medical with severe abdominal cramps. By 11 p.m., 17 more. By 2 a.m. on August 15th, 63 inmates were experiencing symptoms consistent with foodborne illness. At 6 a.m., the number reached 142. At 8 a.m., the Department of Health launched a full outbreak investigation. At 10 a.m., they confirmed the source, Listeria monocytogenes, a dangerous bacteria that thrives in refrigerated environments when temperatures rise above safe levels. By noon, 287 inmates were sick. 4 required hospitalization. At 2 p.m., Dr. Chen returned to Rikers Island as part of the investigation team. She reviewed the kitchen's food safety logs from the past month. Temperature checks were documented daily. Every entry showed the refrigerator at 38 degrees Fahrenheit. But those readings had come from the external gauge, the one showing false data. No one had physically checked the internal temperature in 16 days. At 3:30 p.m., investigators interviewed kitchen staff. Did anyone notice the food seemed warmer than usual? Several workers admitted the dairy products hadn't felt as cold as normal, but they trusted the digital readout. At 4:45 p.m., they pulled the contractor's repair records. Apex Commercial Refrigeration had replaced the compressor on July 29th as documented. But the invoice showed something else. Customer declined recalibration of temperature sensors due to additional cost. Advised to monitor manually. The jail had refused to pay $400 to recalibrate the sensors after the compressor replacement. So the external gauge continued displaying the old set point, 38 degrees Fahrenheit, while the actual temperature inside climbed to unsafe levels. At 6 p.m., investigators discovered a pattern. This wasn't the first time. In March 2019, a similar temperature failure had occurred. Corrected after 3 days. No outbreak, but food had been discarded. In November 2018, another incident. Freezer malfunction. 5 days before detection. In June 2018, a refrigerator in a different Rikers housing unit failed for a week. Every time, the same issue, external gauges showing false readings while internal temperatures drifted into danger zones. Every time, the problem was eventually caught. But this time, it had gone 16 days. Long enough for dangerous bacteria to multiply to infectious levels. At 8 p.m., the outbreak count reached 412 inmates. At 10 p.m., the first inmate was admitted to intensive care with severe dehydration and sepsis. At midnight, investigators made a discovery that changed everything. They reviewed the jail's food safety inspection history. Dr. Chen's August 14th inspection wasn't routine. It was the first health department inspection of Rikers Island kitchens in 7 months. The previous inspection had been canceled due to staffing shortages. Before that, inspections had been quarterly as required. But budget cuts in 2018 had reduced the inspection team. Rikers Island, massive, complex, serving thousands daily, had fallen through the cracks. But when they checked the internal complaint logs from inmates about food quality and safety, everything changed. The complaints had been filed for months. Nobody read them. At 8 a.m. on August 16, 2019, investigators accessed the Rikers Island Inmate Grievance database. Food-related complaints from July 2019, 47. June 2019, 53. May 2019, 61. Going back 6 months, 287 total complaints about food temperature, spoilage, and illness. All categorized as general dissatisfaction and forwarded to the jail's food service administrator. None had triggered investigations. At 9:30 a.m., they interviewed the food service administrator, Patricia Okafor. She'd held the position for 11 months. Hired in September 2018 after the previous administrator retired. Did you review the inmate food complaints? I received weekly summaries. Inmates always complain about the food. It's part of jail culture. These complaints specifically mentioned warm milk, spoiled meat, and stomach illness. Okafor pulled up her files. I forwarded them to kitchen supervisors for review. That's protocol. What did the supervisors report back? That the food met temperature standards. That the complaints were exaggerated. At 10:45 a.m., investigators found the supervisor reports. All signed by Marcus Webb, the kitchen supervisor Dr. Chen had met. Every report stated, temperature logs reviewed. All within safe range. No concerns identified. Webb had been checking the external gauges. The ones displaying false readings. At 11:30 a.m., they interviewed Webb directly. Why didn't you use a probe thermometer to verify internal temperatures? We did. Monthly. Last check was July 15th. Everything was fine. But the compressor was replaced July 29th. Did you check after the repair? Webb hesitated. The contractor said it was fixed. The gauge showed proper temperature. Did you physically verify? The gauge is supposed to be accurate. At 12:15 p.m., investigators discovered the deeper problem. Rikers Island's food safety protocol required daily temperature verification using handheld thermometers. But the jail had only 3 working thermometers for 9 kitchen facilities across 10 separate jail buildings. Kitchen supervisors were supposed to share them on a rotation schedule. The schedule existed on paper. But in practice, supervisors relied on the digital gauges because getting a thermometer from another building took time and coordination. At 1 p.m., they found the budget records. In 2017, Rikers Island had 12 calibrated probe thermometers. In 2018, budget cuts reduced equipment purchases. Broken thermometers weren't replaced. By 2019, only 3 remained functional. Requests for new thermometers had been submitted in January, March, and June 2019. All marked deferred due to budget constraints. Cost to replace 9 thermometers, $340. Cost of the current outbreak investigation and medical treatment, estimated $2.3 million and climbing. At 2:30 p.m., the hospitalization count reached 7 inmates. At 3 p.m., investigators interviewed the deputy warden who had authorized serving the compromised food. You were told by a health inspector that the food was unsafe. Why did you serve it anyway? We had no alternative. We're contractually required to provide 3 meals daily. If we'd thrown out all that food, we'd have had nothing for dinner. Why not arrange emergency food delivery? It was 3 p.m. No vendor could deliver for 7,000 people on 2 hours' notice. And we don't have discretionary budget for emergency purchases over $5,000. That requires approval from central administration. Did you request approval? I called. Got voicemail. It was a Friday afternoon. At 4:15 p.m., they reviewed the decision timeline. 3 p.m., August 14th. Deputy warden decides to serve questionable food rather than leave inmates unfed. 3:30 p.m. Attempts to reach budget approval authority. No response. 4 p.m. Makes final decision to proceed with dinner service using compromised ingredients. 4:30 p.m. Dinner service begins. 6 p.m. Budget authority returns call. Too late. The deputy warden had faced an impossible choice: violate food safety protocols or leave thousands of people without dinner. He chose what seemed like the lesser risk. He was wrong. At 5 p.m., investigators discovered another failure point. Dr. Chen's emergency report on August 14th had been filed with the Department of Health. But it hadn't been automatically shared with the Department of Corrections' central administration. The 2 agencies used different reporting systems. Communication required manual forwarding. By the time DOC administration learned about the contaminated food, it had already been served. At 6:30 p.m., they interviewed inmates who'd filed the earliest complaints. One inmate, Raymond Martinez, had filed 7 separate grievances between May and July 2019. Each described the same issue: milk that wasn't cold enough, cheese that felt warm, sandwiches that tasted off. Each grievance had been logged, forwarded, and marked resolved after kitchen supervisors reported normal temperatures. Did anyone ever interview you about your complaints? No. I just got a written response saying the kitchen had checked and everything was fine. Did you get sick before this outbreak? Yeah. Twice. May and June. Bad stomach issues. Went to medical. They said it was probably stress. At 7:45 p.m., investigators pulled medical records. Between March and August 2019, there had been 73 incidents of gastrointestinal illness among Rikers Island inmates, higher than the previous year's average by 34%. Medical staff had attributed it to various causes: stress, anxiety, unrelated illness. No one had connected it to a potential food safety pattern, because the medical department and the food service department didn't cross-reference their data. At 8:30 p.m., the outbreak total reached 568 inmates. At 9 p.m., one of the hospitalized inmates, a 52-year-old man with diabetes, went into septic shock. At 10:15 p.m., he died. The first fatality. At 11 p.m., the investigation identified the final failure point. After the July 29 compressor repair, Apex Commercial Refrigeration had sent an email to the Rikers Island facility's maintenance coordinator. The email clearly stated, "External temperature display not recalibrated. Recommend manual verification until sensors can be replaced." Sensors quoted at $400. The facility's coordinator had forwarded the email to the kitchen supervisor. Marcus Webb had received it on July 30th. He'd filed it in his inbox and forgotten about it. For 16 days, the email sat unread while the refrigerator ran warm and bacteria multiplied. At midnight on August 17th, investigators briefed city officials. The outbreak had been caused by a cascade of failures. Budget cuts that eliminated equipment. Understaffing that reduced inspections. Siloed departments that didn't communicate. A contractor warning that went unheeded. Inmate complaints that were dismissed. And a split-second decision by a deputy warden who thought he was choosing the lesser evil. And when they analyzed how much the city had spent on Rikers Island food service over the previous decade versus how much had actually reached the kitchens as usable resources, everything changed. The money had been allocated. It just never arrived. At 7 a.m. on August 18, 2019, forensic accountants began analyzing Rikers Island's food service budget from 2010 to 2019. The city allocated $34 million annually for jail food services. But the kitchens received operational budgets averaging $19 million per year. $15 million disappeared into administrative overhead, contracted services, and budget transfers. At 9 a.m., they traced the missing funds. $4.2 million annually went to a food service management contract with Aramark Corporation, a private company that provided consultation and oversight. But kitchen staff reported they rarely saw Aramark representatives. The contract required monthly site visits. Records showed only 6 visits in 2018. $3.1 million went to a separate contract for nutritional compliance monitoring with a consulting firm that produced quarterly reports. The reports were generic. Copied language. Minimal actual assessment of Rikers operations. $2.8 million was categorized as central administrative costs, overhead charged by the Department of Correction for managing food services. The remaining $5 million was absorbed by budget transfers to cover shortfalls in other DOC departments. At 10:30 a.m., investigators discovered the equipment procurement history. In 2015, Rikers Island requested $50,000 for kitchen equipment upgrades including new refrigerators, thermometers, and food safety monitoring systems. Approved in the budget. Never purchased. The funds were redirected to emergency staffing needs in the security department. In 2016, another request, $35,000 for equipment and staff training. Approved. Redirected to facility maintenance. In 2017, 2018, and 2019, similar requests. All approved. All redirected. For 5 years, the kitchens had been promised resources that never materialized. At 11:45 a.m., they interviewed the food service administrator who'd retired in 2018, Patricia Okafor's predecessor. Did you know the budget allocations weren't reaching the kitchens? Of course, I fought it every year. But DOC administration controlled the actual spending. They'd say food service was adequately funded and use the allocated money elsewhere. Why didn't you escalate to the city? I did. Multiple times. Filed reports with the Board of Correction. They'd acknowledge the issue and promise to investigate. Nothing ever changed. At 1 p.m., investigators found those reports. 7 formal complaints between 2014 and 2018 about inadequate food service funding. All filed with the Board of Correction, the independent oversight body for New York City jails. The board had documented each complaint. Requested responses from DOC administration. DOC responses claimed food service was meeting minimum standards and operating within budgetary constraints. The board accepted those responses. Closed the complaints. No follow-up inspections. No verification. At 2:30 p.m., the death toll reached 2. A 67-year-old woman with heart disease had died overnight from complications of severe dehydration. At 3 p.m., they discovered why inmate complaints had been systematically ignored. The grievance system required inmates to file complaints in writing. The forms were reviewed by correctional staff, not independent monitors. Staff categorized complaints by priority: safety threats, medical emergencies, living conditions, and general dissatisfaction. Food complaints were automatically categorized as general dissatisfaction, the lowest priority. These complaints were forwarded to the department responsible, Food Services, for self-investigation. There was no independent verification, no outside review. The system was designed to let departments police themselves. At 4:15 p.m., investigators interviewed Raymond Martinez, the inmate who'd filed 7 food safety complaints, again. "Did you ever think about not eating the jail food?" Martinez laughed bitterly. "And eat what? Commissary costs money. I can't afford to buy all my meals. Most people here can't. We eat what they serve or we don't eat." Did other inmates talk about the food being unsafe? All the time. But what are we supposed to do? We're already in jail. They're not going to listen to us about food being too warm. They barely listen when we're actually dying. At 5:30 p.m., the full picture emerged. For years, city officials had publicly claimed Rikers Island food services were adequately funded. The budget documents supported that claim. But the actual operational reality was different. Kitchens running on half their allocated budget, equipment falling apart, staff overwhelmed, and oversight reduced to paperwork. Meanwhile, the inmates, the only people who experienced the food daily, had been filing warnings for months. Warnings that were filed, documented, and systematically ignored because they came from people the system had already decided weren't credible. At 6:45 p.m., the outbreak total reached 831 inmates. 12 remained hospitalized. At 7:30 p.m., city officials held a press conference. They announced immediate reforms: independent food safety inspections, equipment upgrades, improved complaint review processes. They pledged $5 million in emergency funding for Rikers Island kitchen improvements. They did not mention that $5 million had been allocated and redirected elsewhere every year for the past 5 years. At 9 p.m., Dr. Sarah Chen sat in her office writing her final report. She'd inspected dozens of facilities over 12 years. She'd found violations, issued citations, closed restaurants and schools. But Rikers Island was different. The violations weren't the result of negligence or ignorance. They were the predictable outcome of a system designed to appear functional while actually failing. A system where money was allocated but never delivered. Where oversight existed on paper but not in practice. Where the people most affected, the inmates, could file unlimited complaints that would be documented, filed, and ignored. At 10:30 p.m., she included a paragraph that would later be quoted in news reports. This outbreak was not caused by a single refrigerator malfunction. It was caused by years of systemic resource deprivation masked by administrative rhetoric about adequate funding. The inmates warned us. They warned us repeatedly. We had their complaints in writing. We chose not to believe them because believing them would have required acknowledging that the system was broken. And acknowledging it was broken would have required fixing it. 6 months later, Rikers Island had new refrigerators, new thermometers, and a new inspection protocol. The administrative contracts with Aramark and the consulting firm were terminated. The Board of Correction implemented independent complaint review for food safety issues. Patricia Okafor resigned. Marcus Webb was reassigned. The deputy warden took early retirement. No one faced criminal charges. The deaths were ruled accidental, the result of systemic failures, not individual misconduct. The 2 inmates who died were both awaiting trial. Neither had been convicted of any crime. They died because the city couldn't find $340 for thermometers in a $34 million annual budget. But across the country, in jails and prisons from Los Angeles to Miami, the same budget structures exist. The same administrative overhead consuming resources meant for basic services. The same complaint systems designed to document problems without actually addressing them. The same assumption that incarcerated people are unreliable witnesses to their own living conditions. This could happen again. Because the structure that caused it, budgets that look adequate on paper while operations starve, oversight that documents without verifying, and complaint systems that listen without hearing, exists in correctional facilities across America. Rikers Island fixed its refrigerators. But the incentives that led to the crisis, the administrative systems that enabled it, and the assumptions about whose voices matter? Those are still running. Still waiting for the next breakdown. Still counting on someone to notice before people die. If this story shook you, the next one will be worse.